Good afternoon. My name is Jared Carney, founder and CEO of Lightdale, LLC, which is a private investment and advisory firm based in Santa Monica, California. And on behalf of myself and my alma mater, the Milken Institute, welcome to the 2019 Global Conference. It's gotten bigger, it's gotten better, and one of the ways it's gotten better is the intellectual depth that the program provides people. I see my former partner, Skip Reimer, who ran our programs for many years when we were together at the Institute, and he had as much to do with that as anybody else. So the topic today is really a vision of the present and future and our digital lives that really should be summed up through the title of one of the books that's been written by our panelists, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. That author is Shoshana Zuboff. Shoshana is the Emeritus Professor Charles Edward Wilson, Emerita Professor at Harvard Business School, and some of you may have interacted with her at HBS. And next to her is experienced tech investor, author in his own right of a book that some of you may have already read, some of you may have on your list, Zucked, by Roger McNamee. Roger is somebody who I only got to really truly meet today, but our paths have crossed numerous times in the tech industry, which I worked in before I worked at the Milken Institute. I had about a 13-year career in technology, which is important because it's a material disclosure in terms of this conversation. Because really, Roger and I, in a working environment, were there at the beginning, at the inception of the technologies and the impact that they've had on consumer life and behavior that we're going to talk about today. And Shoshana has given us a framework to understand, explain, analyze, and hopefully even move forward with a toolbox for addressing how we can actually have a viable human future in a digital world. So, with that, they have obviously deep, very impressive backgrounds and resumes. I encourage you to read their full biographies on the website because we don't like to take too much time with introductions. We like to get into it. Shoshana, I think you kind of set the table here with this beautiful book that you've written. And it's not often that a person would call a book like this beautiful, but I'll tell you, you don't really get to read a exhaustive analytical tome like this that also weaves in W.H. Auden so many times. So I recommend both books to everybody, and both are surprising in numerous ways. But why don't you start us out with a definition of what surveillance capitalism is and why we're here?
Surveillance capitalism. Any former students in the room, just in case? No. I was at the bar yesterday, and I met a former student, someone I hadn't seen in many, many years. I thought I'd ask. All right, so what is surveillance capitalism? In a sense, there's an intuitive ring here, surveillance capitalism. In the book, I write about many ways in which surveillance capitalism diverges from the history of market capitalism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But let me start with one way in which surveillance capitalism emulates the history of the evolution of capitalism. So everybody knows that, for example, industrial capitalism evolved in part by claiming things that lived outside the market dynamic and bringing them into the marketplace for sale and purchase. So famously, industrial capitalism claimed nature for the market dynamic, converting it to raw material, converting it to real estate, converting it to land that could be sold and purchased. In this pattern, surveillance capitalism also claims something that has lived outside the marketplace, but now with a dark and unexpected twist. Because surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims private human experience for the marketplace. It claims private human experience as a free source of raw material to be rendered as behavioral data, to be captured for its predictive value, to converge with its new production process, which we know as machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, machine learning. And from this production process, we get a new class of product. These products are predictions of human behavior. I call them prediction products. And they are sold into a new kind of marketplace, a marketplace that trades exclusively in human futures. Now, in case what I've just said to you, and parentheses, what I've just said to you is a sequential economic logic, the bare bones of surveillance capitalism. But in case what I've just said to you sounds just a tiny bit science fiction-y, let me say that everything I've just said describes what we first understood as online targeted advertising markets. Mm-hmm. And all one has to do is zoom out just a tiny bit, just abstract a tiny bit, and you see each of these elements in play. After all, what was a click-through rate except a computational prediction of a fragment of human behavior? And what is an online targeted advertising market vying over these predictions, except a group of business customers who, it turns out, have had a keen interest in understanding what we will do now, soon, and later. These were the first markets for human futures. Since then, this logic that I've just described to you, not only did it migrate from Google, where it originated, to Facebook, where it was further elaborated, but ultimately became the default logic of the tech sector, and now is migrating across the normal economy in virtually every economic sector: insurance, retail, education, finance, healthcare, all the way back to fundamental products and services. I'll stop there.
That paints a heck of a picture. And
I hope so.
I think with that definition, Roger, why don't you take us to why you started investing in technology and what the promise was in your mind when you began to, Silver Lake Partners, Elevation Partners, what you were trying to do.
So imagine this. When I began my career as a technology investor, the biggest program in Silicon Valley was the space shuttle. It was before personal computers were an industry. So I was lucky enough to be there from the beginning of PCs, through enterprise, networking, the internet, first time, and the whole thing. When I met Mark Zuckerberg in 2006, he was 22. Facebook was 2 years old. It was still available only to college students and high school students. So here's the thing. The Silicon Valley that I joined in 1982 was very idealistic, and it espoused a version of libertarianism that was built around the notion of empowering individuals. Right? The whole ethos was productivity, and productivity in a way that essentially made people better off. Not just corporations, but people too. Beginning in about 2003, a fundamental shift took place that changed my perception of Silicon Valley entirely. And the core element was this. The Valley from 1956 to 2003 was always struggling with limited engineering resources. There was never enough processing power or memory or storage or bandwidth to do what you wanted to do. So each product had to be fine-tuned to grab the single most valuable use that a customer would pay for. You couldn't really hurt anybody because you were so limited on what the products could do. The notion of a global product like Google or Facebook was impossible before 2003. But what happened was Moore's law and Metcalfe's law, the two things governing semiconductors and networks, crossed over a key threshold in 2002.
Define them for everybody.
So Moore's law basically was the thing that says the processing power per dollar doubles every 18 months for a semiconductor, and Metcalfe's law says that the value of a network increases as the square of the number of nodes on the network. So essentially it's two things interplay, because as the networks get bigger, as the cost of semiconductors is cheaper, the networks get larger, and these things interplay with each other. You can make better semiconductors to design better networks, et cetera, and it plays back and forth. And finally, it crossed over in 2003. It happens to cross over while we're still in retreat from the market bubble bursting in 2000. So the venture guys are completely asleep. And a very small group of people who'd all worked at PayPal, led by Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and Reid Hoffman, saw this in a way no one else did. And the critical element was that they recognized you could do global products. They recognized that there were no barriers, and that they brought a different philosophy. Their libertarianism was not about empowering people, it was about making monopolies. It was about getting huge and rich very quickly. And so they built companies with no governors, no safety nets, no circuit breakers, none of the usual things that you put just in case something goes wrong. And I began to have a problem with investing in Silicon Valley, because you saw two classes of company get created. First, ones that took their sense of entitlement so seriously that they just basically broke the law. This would be Uber, Lyft, Airbnb. They just said those laws don't apply to us. And then you get the kind that were just purely predatory. There's a group of people that are either our customers or our suppliers. They don't understand what's going on. We're going to take advantage of them. That would be Spotify. That would be the fintech companies. And all of that to me was troubling. But I thought Facebook was different. And so when I met Mark...
Why? Because he was young?
I thought there were a couple of things. The first thing was he required authenticated identity at the beginning, right? You had to have your school email address. And the problem with all social networks before him was that trolls would come in using anonymity. So bullies and trolls would take over and destroy everything. And Mark didn't have that.
We had that problem at PeopleLink at Idealab.
You had that problem with literally everything. I mean, you had it with AOL, you had it with Friendster, you had it with MySpace. So everybody had that problem. So Mark had a different thing, and his idealism, I hoped, could be moderated. And to borrow a phrase from Shoshana, I brought Typhoid Mary into the company by bringing Sheryl Sandberg from Google into Facebook, and she brought with her this understanding of the early versions of surveillance capitalism. And I was like clueless, and I totally hold myself responsible for that. And if you will, went through a moment of self-judgment where I had to decide, okay, I was part of this, I helped to make it happen, I made a lot of money out of it. But we have the Sorcerer's Apprentice. This thing is out of control, and it's literally going to destroy the economy. It's essentially, these guys are going to do what the robber barons were doing at the beginning of the 20th century. They're going to parade their way first through media, then through transportation, then through banking, and they're going to and they're essentially going to convert all these guys into peripherals. The car guys think they're going to make money from having smart cars. It's ridiculous. Amazon and Google are going to make all the money, right? And the banks go, oh man, we've got all these really smart mathematicians. Yeah, but you don't have the data. You're totally screwed. These guys are going to roll right over you. And we have a moment in time to stop these guys, and that moment in time is right now. And the people in this room, we all ought to be on the same side here, okay? Because this is about your future. This is about the future of democracy. It's about the future of capitalism. And Shoshana, she is the person who has written the book, okay? I mean, I had a set of hypotheses. She had done the data, okay? And it's compelling.
So we understand where you are now, and we understand that you're really an activist now.
I am.
Right. And this conference is dedicated to the idea of meaningful lives. And if you can't make other people's lives meaningful as well as your own, obviously it's pretty much for naught. But Shoshana, in your book, what you do at great length and exhaustively is you don't just sort of set the rubric as you laid out in the definition of surveillance capitalism. You also talk about some very real psychological realities that the surveillance capital companies, I guess is the best way I can put it, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world, understand are actually very sophisticated about. So what your book really is it's not just a business book, but it's also a psychology book. It's also a behavioral psychology book. It's also a sociological book. It's also an anthropological book. You know, do you consider yourself a social scientist? I mean, what set of values and what framework did you bring to understanding and diagnosing this situation?
Well, I think, you know, whenever you're trying to understand something that's happening in the world, a real phenomenon, it requires many different disciplines and many different points of view. It requires historical understanding. It requires moral philosophical understanding. It requires technical understanding. And of course, so one of the things that characterized my life as a scholar, and one reason why the Harvard Business School was a very congenial place for my career was that I've always been interdisciplinary and brought to bear as many different points of view as were necessary to understand the phenomenon. So,
so when you look at the companies, when you look at Facebook, when you look at Google, because it's not possible for us to get too deep into the book in this limited time that we have.
Of course.
How do you unpack what Roger was talking about before, in terms of what they know, how they know it, when they know it about us, and building those predictive products that, you know, ultimately are about, as you call, defining and shaping and owning our behavior in the book?
Okay. Well, let me say maybe 3 things about that. Number one, I come to this problem trying to elucidate what I call the economic imperatives, right? So, you know, we joke about Typhoid Mary and stuff, but in fact, somebody confronted me at an event a few weeks ago, like, well, are you saying these are bad people? No, I'm not saying these are bad people. I'm saying this is an economic logic that is internally consistent, and it has economic imperatives. I guarantee you, once you understand the economic imperatives, you understand what actors within these systems are compelled to do and what their systems and practices are compelled to create. And no matter how many times we say, dude, we need privacy, we're not going to get privacy, because privacy is inimical to these imperatives. So first of all, we've talked about the fact that we're taking human experience, we're converting it to data, and then we're scraping off the flows of data that are more than they need to actually improve their services. More than they need, but these data have tremendous predictive value. So this is a surplus, and that's what goes into their supply chains. Now, we saw that the supply chains merge with machines and come out with prediction products and are sold into markets. If we look at the competitive dynamics of those markets and kind of reverse engineer those competitive dynamics, that's where we understand the imperatives. And I'm going to say them very, very quickly. Number one, it becomes clear that to have the best predictions, we need a lot of data. Everybody knows that, right? So economies of scale. Second phase of competition. We still need a lot of data, but that's not quite enough. We need varieties of data. So let's get you out of your desk, off your laptop, into the world. Oh, I've got an idea. I'll give you a phone. It's a little computer. You can keep it in your pocket. Now I know everything about where you go, what you do, who you talk to, what you eat, what you shop, and so forth. Scope, varieties of data, economies of scope. I can tell your emotions from your face. I can tell from your gait, from your posture. All right. Third phase of competition. We need scale, we need scope, but now we understand that the most predictive data comes from intervening in your behavior and finding ways, subtle ways, subliminal ways, ways that are celebrated for always being outside of our awareness, but that nevertheless tune, herd, H-E-R-D, modify our behavior toward those directions that satisfy the commercial requirements of the surveillance capitalists and their business customers in these new markets.
All right, let's take a pause there because I think this is extremely important to understand. So first of all, there are a few things you said there. First of all, business customers. Right?
Business customers.
Business customers, important. So we'll explain that in just a moment. Second of all, I have 11-year-old, 9-year-old children. So what you're talking about is herding, shaping behavior of human beings at various stages of social, emotional, mental development.
Yes.
Which is, that's tectonic in its implications.
And you think the critical thing for all of you when you run your business is you think you're going to control your relationship with your customer, with the consumer? It's nonsense. These people control the menu. They control the choices. So if you're a marketer, they give you perfect information on essentially all consumers, but they control the data the consumers get, not you, okay? And the effect of that is they wipe out the value of brand because anybody can buy access. And the consumers on the underside, it's not a market because they have there's no uncertainty. One side has perfect information, the other side has only the information they're given. And that is why they're going to be able to run through every single category because no matter how strong your current market position is, it can't compete with a guy who has all the data and control of the menu.
Is that your contention about what Amazon is doing right now?
That's my contention with Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft are all doing. And not in Amazon and Microsoft's case, it's against a portion of their business. In the case of the other two, it's on the whole thing, right? Yeah. But this is, look at the margins. So every one of you would like to be part of this business. And the problem is, I hate to tell you, you're too late. It's about scale. And the first guy who starts wins. And remember, those of you who sell your data to them, you're nuts. I mean, the banks, the credit card processors, the credit rating agencies, the telcos, the health and wellness apps who sell the data to these guys, you're sowing the seeds of your own destruction.
Okay. So, well, let's put a pin in the idea that...
My point is we have the power to stop it.
Right.
That's what's cool.
But let's put a pin in the idea that it's monolithic and monopolistic, because I want to come back to that. But between then and now, are there any actors in the market who, for ethical, moral imperative, or even business reasons, take a different tack? Do you see any companies behaving any differently who, say that no, we're going to be big data, we're going to use big data, but we're not going to be a surveillance capitalist company?
I think one of the less intuitive but very important ways to look at this is that in a very real way, surveillance capitalism can be considered as a colossal market failure. And that's counterintuitive in the sense because the companies that Roger just enumerated, as we know, have world historic levels of market capitalization. So how can we say that they're a market failure? But at the same time, we know that if we look on the, I'm going to call it the user side, not the consumer side, because these really are not two-sided markets, as is often said, because one side is not a market exchange and one side is. The futures markets are a market exchange, but what the users are actually not users.
They're fuel.
They are used.
They're a natural resource.
They are used.
They're a natural resource.
As free raw material. All right. So going back to the early 2000s, every single time we have a piece of research, whether it's interview research or survey research, that says to people who are interfacing with these systems, hey, let me take back the veil and tell you a little bit what's really going on behind stage here, the surveillance in the surveillance capitalism. Whenever people learn about that, the reaction is the same. I don't like it. I reject it. I feel outraged by it. How do I hide from it? How do I protect myself from it? And yet we know people keep using the systems. And so in the literature, this is referred to as a privacy paradox. This is not a paradox. It's a market failure. Because what's happened over the last 2 decades is what we see as the foreclosure of alternatives. We're at a stage now where the internet is essentially owned and operated by private surveillance capital. Private surveillance capital. That same milieu where we expected, as Roger was saying, emancipation and democratization,
Right.
is now a place that is owned and operated by private surveillance capital at our expense. So my view is that, and I think there are 3 pieces to this theory of change, but one piece is that as we begin to shift public opinion and awareness, and actually through that summon what in my mind is inevitable, the laws and the new regulatory regimes that are going to begin to interrupt and outlaw some of these key mechanisms, we're creating space here for the competitive solutions that people are crying out for. The only reason that these companies can continue to generate revenue the way they do is because not only do they have within firm monopolies, they have across industry monopolies. The economic logic itself, surveillance capitalism, has monopolized all channels on the internet.
Can you give us an example, an illustration of that?
I mean, I can give you as many examples as you want to sit here for, but just take a given day. I want to get my kids' grades from their teachers. I want to get the results from my health tests from my doctor's office. I want to organize dinner with my family and friends. Every single thing that I do, that you do to live a minimally effective life, participating in the society, forces me to march through the same channels that are surveillance capitalism supply chains.
So, Jared, let me answer the question, then you finish this point, but you asked about the contrary people.
Yeah.
And I would point to 2 that have made it a business model to this point, but both are a danger always, and it may be the personalities of the CEOs, and that would be Apple and Netflix. Mm-hmm. Both of these companies are in a position to do extraordinary harm. And in Apple's case, they have done many, many things that are designed to offer to their customers a counterweight to this whole system. Now, they are only just beginning to undermine the mechanisms of surveillance capital as employed on the system. But if you look at their credit card, for example, that will be the first credit card in the market where there will be no data leakage as long as you don't use an affinity relationship. And they have a lot of things like that. Their facial recognition never leaves the phone. Apple Pay is like paying with cash, right? With their Apple Maps, right, they don't save, part of the reason it doesn't perform as well is they don't save the data. Part of the reason Siri doesn't perform as well is the processing takes place on your phone. All of these things are designed to protect you. And with Netflix...
Designed to protect or designed to differentiate themselves from others?
It works to the same thing. At this point, in order to differentiate, you have to protect. And I think the really interesting question is whether Apple moves to a model of embedding the hardware in the service deal that they have. So imagine they have a subscription deal for the services. Imagine they add hardware to that like in cable. So you pay $30, $50, $75 a month for various bundles of services, including the hardware. That's the point at which Apple finally puts us in a position to undo some elements of the monopoly. Because Android, if you have an Android phone, seriously, you might as well be handing out your personal financial statements, your itinerary, all of your correspondence, and walking down the street buck naked. Because Oracle has done this amazing thing. You can find it on YouTube where they've done this analysis of all the data leakage from an Android, and it's breathtaking. Okay? And the notion that they're getting away with this just boggles the mind.
All right, let's talk about that. So, Shoshana, how are these companies getting away with this on a historical basis, historical view, and on a present-day view? And let's parse that into sort of at the policy level and at the consumer level.
I ask the question, how do they get away with it? And I answer it with 16 reasons.
It's a big...
Examined in depth, but do not fear. I will not go into all 16 right now. But all right, so let's talk on the policy side just for a tiny bit. So all of this has to be located in history. Google discovered, invented, stumbled into, but then figured out what it had stumbled into and leveraged it, elaborated surveillance capitalism in the teeth of financial emergency, 2000, 2001. Kept it quiet, kept it hidden until 2004 when it IPO'd. At that point, it became clear that Google's revenues from 2000 to 2004 had increased by 3,590%. So part of how they got away with it was that they set a bar for rapid monetization that appealed to the impatient capital of venture investors, Roger. And once that bar was set, you know, who can compete? What other kind of startup in the Valley is going to compete with folks who are going to do as the crow flies and not do what Schumpeter, the great economist Joseph Schumpeter, had suggested? Y'all have heard of the phrase creative destruction, which is just a little Schumpeter ripoff. But the fact is that that little phrase was embedded in a very big discussion about economic evolution. And Schumpeter said, you want to move the dial of economic history? That's a mutation that is going to lift the standard of living of all people and be deeply institutionalized, and every aspect will be scrupulously worked through. And it can take decades or even a century. Well, no one's going to hang around and follow Schumpeter's advice when you can do as the crow flies and get your funding right away. So that's one thing, impatient capital. A second thing is 9/11. On September 10th, 2001, there's a memo in Congress from the FTC delineating the fact that we're going to need comprehensive privacy legislation in this country. They had already come to the conclusion that the internet companies would not be capable of self-regulation. They're looking at the cookies, they're looking at the web bugs, they're looking at the refusal of the companies to heed the FTC. We've never heard of that since. And so the idea was, we're going to need law, guys. All right. That thing was circulating around, serious conversations. September 11th occurs. Within 24 hours, the conversation changes utterly. Now it's total information awareness. And in the days and weeks and months and years that followed, these fledgling companies in Silicon Valley with their genius young people running them were buffered and nurtured and protected from law outside of democratic and constitutional oversight, largely with the view that they would be able to develop the surveillance capabilities that would not be able easily to be developed in Washington, where those laws ultimately were going to be imposed and at some level had to be reckoned with.
Right. So
Did you want to ask?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that these companies hid behind national security and
they didn't have to hide.
They didn't have to hide.
I'm not saying that they,
I
well,
have another
I'm
question
saying
about
that
it, too.
they, I call it the idea of elective affinity, the idea that there was a natural affinity between the needs of the intelligence agencies and some of the key cabinet departments and the needs of a fledgling company, especially Google at this point in time, we're talking about, to grow its capabilities unfettered by law. And as you know, they developed a world-class lobbying capability to keep themselves free of law year after year. and successfully over the past 2 decades.
And they made great products so that there was no, seriously, there was no pressure from consumers at all. So if you're a politician, you expect lots of campaign contributions, you got a ton of lobbying coming in, and 100% of your constituents like the services that they're getting from these guys, right? I mean, politically speaking, it was a perfect situation in which to do exactly what Shoshana's described.
And I want to come back, Roger, I want you to give us a little inside baseball about that moment from your days with Facebook. But Shoshana, you mentioned oversight and governance in the form of the U.S. federal government. To the best of my understanding, the U.S. Constitution actually does not guarantee the right of privacy.
Yeah, but the U.S. Constitution guarantees a lot of other things. And for example, you know, it's funny how things get lost to historical memory. But there was a very important Senate subcommittee that was convened in 1971. In 1971, in the post-Cold War era, where behavioral modification techniques that had been used a lot in the Cold War and were very popular thanks to a guy named B.F. Skinner, one of my professors at Harvard, when I was a graduate student, who wrote a famous book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. As graduate students, we used to call it Toward Slavery and Humiliation. In any case, the Senate subcommittee was convened specifically to examine behavioral modification in programs that get federal funding. Behavioral modification was being used in schools, in hospitals, in mental health facilities, in prisons, on captive populations. This was a bipartisan committee. Not only did it include Strom Thurmond. I know there's some folks, usually I'm talking to people, and no one in the room is old enough to even know who Strom Thurmond is, but I know I'm not alone in this room, okay?
We remember Strom Thurmond.
So like, you had Strom Thurmond, you had Ed Kennedy, you had Birch Bayh, and it was convened by Sam Ervin, Watergate fame, all right? So these were illustrious senators. And what they said, understanding behavioral modification, because I've already explained to you that behavioral modification at scale, automated at scale, is now key to the competitive success of surveillance capitalism. And what they said was that the founding fathers recognized that individuality is at the heart of freedom, and that behavioral modification is a direct assault on human autonomy, on individual sovereignty, and therefore a direct assault on freedom. That no democratic society can successfully exist without these elements. And they, through 2 years of hearings and exhaustive research, they ended up concluding that no federal funding would go to any program that was using these techniques. And the worst thing about it, they said, was that these techniques were being unfurled absent of any law, absent of any democratic oversight. All right? That was the 70s. I mean, I was a young woman in the 70s. It seems to me like it was yesterday. I know for my kids it seems like it might as well have been 1812. But the point is that it was not that long ago, my friends. And now we are living in a world where behavior modification is saturating our environments. From the devices in your home to the game Pokemon Go. Ask me about it if you want to know more, or
Great
I
work
can
on
tell
it.
you the pages in the book to read.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But the point is, the digital surround has now been hijacked by surveillance capitalism to be a global system of behavior modification. I assure you that is not an overstatement. And yet, we say nothing. And yet, we do not rebel. And yet, no Senate subcommittee is convened to assert the values of our democracy despite the word. Any of you see that film yet, A Matter of Sex, about Ruth Bader Ginsburg? So at the end, you know, the judges say to her, the word woman does not appear in the Constitution. And she says, Your Honors, the word freedom does not appear in the Constitution. And yet, that is what we're here to fight for. Well, the word privacy may not appear in the Constitution, but without it, there is no democracy. Ergo, it is our turn now to fight this fight. And here I come back to the themes that Roger has been raising. This is not this is not a kind of fight that you fight once a century or once every other century. This is a fight that every generation has to fight. We're already handing over a world, a physical world, defined by climate catastrophe. And now we have a new kind of social catastrophe on our hands, one that is bad for capitalism, one that is bad for people, one that is bad for human freedom, and one that is on a profound collision course with democracy.
So Roger, let's talk about that hijacking, and let's go inside the hijacking. So it's hard to have a hijacking without hijackers.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are these people conscious that they're hijacking something?
So I think Shoshana made a point before. These are not bad people, but they operate with a philosophy that is a natural outgrowth of a world where, you know, traditional capitalism, the role of government is to set the rules and then enforce them fairly across the whole country, the whole economy. And for the last 40 years, we've been unwinding the role of government. So they're coming into an environment with essentially no rules, where there's literally, as Shoshana said, no scrutiny of what they're doing. In fact, they're being egged on by the government. So Shoshana makes a point in her book that I think is profoundly important about the underlying philosophy of these guys. They sit there and see a lot of human misery and a lot of sadness in the world. And they go, if only we can convert all of human experience into data, we can eliminate all the inefficiency and all the uncertainty that's making people sad. And as she said, it's an internally consistent philosophy, and they operate on it with religious zeal, and they're quite open about the philosophy. I mean, you know, you can see the mentors of these people, and they've been talking about this since Skinner, right?
Absolutely.
But I am a creature of, you know, I was a history major in college, and I studied the Enlightenment. I studied the formation of the Constitution. And I learned that uncertainty is the foundation for choice. And choice is fundamental to the capitalist system. In fact, another word for choice is free will, right? And so I'm sitting there going, I don't think they're bad people, but I think they have a really dangerous philosophy in an environment where there are no countervailing pressures of any kind.
Take us inside the boardroom. Take a, you know, there are a number of amazing
What boardroom?
anecdotes.
These guys have total control in the hands of the founders. There's no board of directors. There is literally no countervailing force of any kind anywhere in the system. I mean, right now, you're looking at a measurable percentage of the countervailing force. Not much. You follow me? You can't like our odds.
I know you meant that as a compliment.
I did, but I'm just saying, by number, we are not many, okay? We're punching above our weight, but we're not many.
Conscience? Any echoes of conscience amongst others?
I believe they are idealistic. I really believe that most of these people
I get you.
think that the world would be better off if they didn't have to debate whether they ate breakfast or not in the morning, whether they didn't have to debate whether they exercise, where everything is known. I mean, Google sits there with anybody here use either, you know, Google Maps or Waze, right? You all do, right? Well, here's the thing. Google believes it is their job to load balance, which means a portion of you on every, you know, of every 1,000 trips, some percentage of people are being sent on routes that are known to be inferior, to both determine how long it takes to take that route and to balance the load. Why? Because they believe that they are exceptional and they're entitled to play God relative to traffic. And I'm sitting here.
This is Los Angeles, Roger.
I'm saying, time out, okay? We need to have, my point here is, you don't have to take my word for it that they're wrong. I just want you to engage in the conversation. I think we need to have a debate about this before we just roll over and let it happen, right? Because each one of you has control of some constituency, right? When the politicians come through for 2020, you can get in their grill and ask them what they're going to do about this.
Yeah, we have to move on to what we're going to do about it because we don't have all the time in the world, unfortunately.
Oh, yes, we do.
Shoshana, you do a great job in your book of creating new ways of understanding the power construct that is going on in surveillance capitalism. And you talk about the two species of power. I wish we had the slide. Roger and I talked about this when we talked previously, to show it's worth it alone to get this book just for this explication of the two species of power. Unfortunately, nobody will be able to see it from here, but if you could just give a quick overview, because I think it's important for everybody to understand how you evaluate the power construct and the implementation and the motivations for wielding that power.
Thank you for asking about that, Jared, because it is interesting. I've been talking about the book with wonderful groups of people since early January, and it's so hard to get past what is surveillance capitalism and how does it work. But really, when we're talking about behavioral modification at scale, automated, using the digital surround, hijacking the digital surround as this means of behavioral modification. And if you're using Waze, that, by the way, is one of the frontiers for these new systems right now, because they've constituted these new futures markets. We're not only telling you the route, but they're telling you, where to go buy a cheeseburger, and then they're getting paid from McDonald's. Anyway, just out in the news recently, in case you haven't read about that. So one has to ask oneself, what is the power, the usurped power, to modify another human being's behavior? What kind of power is that? And we hear night and day, Orwell, Big Brother, digital totalitarianism. But this is not correct. This is not Big Brother. This is not digital totalitarianism. We forget totalitarianism is a form of power that worked on the mechanisms of terror and violence, murder. Totalitarianism meant to own you from the inside out. It didn't simply want your conformity. It wanted your heart and your soul. Remember Stalin's The Engineering of the Soul. This new power now being implemented on a global basis to modify human behavior, I call it instrumentarian power for two reasons. One, it uses the instrumentation of the digital milieu as its means, as its medium. And two, it turns our behavior into an instrumentality, a means to others' market ends. So not for us, but about us. So instrumentarian power does not want to own our souls. In fact, it doesn't really care anything about us. If you picture the experimenter in the lab coat with the rat running around the maze, the experimenter says the rat has no insides. It has no thoughts, no emotions, no consciousness. The rat only has measurable behavior. That's all I care about. In the same way, surveillance capitalism and its instrumentarian power, it's not trying to solve our problems. It doesn't care if you're healthy or you're not healthy. It doesn't care if you're happy or sad. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It only cares that you're doing all those things, being rich or being poor, being healthy or being unhealthy, that you're doing those things in ways that it can capture the data. That's really all it cares about. I call this radical indifference, taken precisely from the radical behaviorist point of view of the experimenter. And Skinner, died with the belief that human beings have no insides, they have no consciousness, they have no emotion, they have no feeling. They only have their responses to reinforcements. And that's essentially how surveillance capitalism operates to herd our behavior. And the very strange thing about this, and I'll stop after I say that, but it comes back to something I know you were trying to ask me about earlier. what is the kind of social world that this creates? So Roger says that they are idealists. But this is an idealism that is the same as absolutism. Remember, absolutism is also idealism. It's idealism without democracy is absolutism.
There's a bit of nihilism in there too, isn't there?
And what this does is to create, contrary, again, counterintuitive, a perspective on society that is deeply collectivist.
The hive.
I call it the hive and the hive mentality. So here we have the surveillance capitalists who fly under Hayek's flag, you know, the flag of anti-regulation, the flag of free enterprise, the flag of, you know, free actors, free market actors, no regulation, no law. We have the law of the survival of the fittest. We don't need any other law, just as J.P. Morgan once said. But in fact, their vision of society is of a hive that is tuned and herded from the outside by an elite, the idealists, who have the knowledge and manipulate the digital surround and the social comparison dynamics of this closeness that we're all into now through hyperconnection. Yeah. And all of this is manipulated to drive this collective toward the perfect outcome. Right. Except it's the perfect outcome for them and not for us. And this is a world now in which computation replaces democracy. Computation replaces citizenship and governance.
It also replaces brand.
What?
It replaces brand. All of you guys whose companies have built brands over a long period of time, just think about this. If you put everybody into a hive, if you take away choice, what's brand? Brand is a choice. And, you know, I mean, it sounds great if you're in the car loan business that you can turn the car off if the payment is an hour late. But it also means that the value of brand is zero, right? I mean, all of these things are about, it's a really dramatic change in the way capitalism would work.
Yeah.
Well, you used the language earlier. You referred to it as a religious choice by the folks up in the valley.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are new, you know, religious choices and constructs that are being crafted and created.
And we're not part, the critical thing to understand is there is a priesthood here.
Yeah.
And
We're
unless
not
you
part of
guys
it.
work at Facebook,
Yeah.
Google, Amazon, or Microsoft, you're not part of it. And no matter how powerful you think you are today, they got the data, okay? And they are instrumenting all the processes that you make. And they know what you're doing, right? I mean, here's the worst part, right? You're all in the room with the two of us, right? So they're going to just follow you from now on, just in case.
We wouldn't be giving you a good toolbox unless we made you a little paranoid.
Just to for a tiny second build on your idea of brand.
Yeah.
Brand, by definition, means a boundary. Brand is a boundary. A boundary from the point of view of this totalizing effort. A boundary is friction.
Yeah.
Brand is the enemy. Brand is friction. All boundaries must go. And that's why we're
all in this
zone
together,
here,
okay?
beyond monopoly.
Big lifeboat.
Beyond anything that antitrust law was ever written for.
Yeah.
And that's why we need a new era of law and regulation. Antitrust law is going to be essential because, by the way, we also have ruthless capitalists here as well as ruthless surveillance capitalists. So it's not like we've blown by all those issues of traditional monopoly, but now we have strictly 21st century issues that have been introduced by an unprecedented economic logic for which we will also need new law, new regulatory regimes to interrupt and outlaw these mechanisms.
And from what we've seen in Europe and from what we've even seen in glimmerings in Washington, D.C., I think the minds are open, if not the actual actions. But there certainly has to be a concerted effort on the part of, as you called them, the ruthless capitalists, not the ruthless surveillance capitalists, to fold this into their regular communications and relationships that they have with those policymakers who influence, obviously, the regulators. Let's take some questions from the audience. I'm just going to ask.
Are there any ladies who can-
They're going to ask, and there's a microphone. Please make
Start
them.
with her right
Please, let's make them questions, please, and not speeches. Thanks a lot. Yes, ma'am.
What about China? I mean, China's going to take advantage of this construct that you described, right?
So if you sit down with Google and Facebook today, they say, you cannot regulate us because you need us to compete in AI against China. Now, what is China doing in AI? They're doing behavioral modification, something they call social credit. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft now control 70+% of all AI professionals in North America. They are all working on behavioral modification. Question number one, why, if Google thinks this is the most important technology of the 21st century, are they about to embed a search engine based on that exact technology in China with Chinese people running it? Question number one. Remember, we sent the Rosenbergs the electric chair for essentially the same thing. Question number two. Why in God's name does the United States want to compete with China in behavioral modification? I look at China and go, let them do it. They have a different culture, a different political system. We should be doing the million other great things you can do with AI. AI should be the technology penicillin of the 21st century, not the thing that essentially converts everybody into a hive. So I look at China and go, look, the internet's breaking up, it's balkanizing. China, North America, Europe, right? It may get further balkanized. That is the fault of these people. It's because this is the only self-defense mechanism you have now is to shut yourself off.
I would just add one tiny piggyback on that, and that is that what China is becoming now is the convergence of instrumentarian power and an authoritarian state. All right? So that convergence is the nightmare scenario for the digital future, for all of us. So what stands between us and that nightmare scenario? I've been thinking about this every hour of every day for at least the past 10 years, and I've got it narrowed down to one word, and that one word is democracy. That unless we all are able to double down on democracy, the differences between our direction and where the Chinese are out in front of us are not going to be that great. And so this is an essential challenge for our future.
Thank you. Next, Pablo?
Yeah, I'm just curious to know if Europe is ahead of the U.S. in introducing regulation. There's talk about that. And the second question I have is if you can give us a glimpse into how the effectiveness of artificial intelligence is going to work if you're restricting all of this, if you end up regulating and you're not picking up all of the data of how humans behave and all of this, how will that, because I think the power of artificial intelligence is to use that data in a positive way, but if people start to say, I don't want my data to be used, how is it going to work?
So Europe and the downside of limitation or choice.
Well, so Europe, as we all know, last May, the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation in Europe went into effect. Great people have been working on this for many years, and it represents a big step forward. But it's not enough to solve the problems that we've just been talking about here. I've spent a lot of time in Brussels this winter. Some of the key people who are architects of the GDPR agree with me on this. I'll give you one quick example. The GDPR, data privacy, three key pillars: data ownership, data accessibility, data portability. Well, what we know is that once we start talking about data ownership, in a way it's game over as far as contesting surveillance capitalism. Because as soon as you start talking about data ownership, it's like, if you come over to me and you just steal my pen, and then let's say I start arguing with you, like, well, okay, you could have it for 2 hours a day, but I get to have it for the rest of the day, okay? So what I've done is I've already legitimated the fact that now it's partially your pen once I start negotiating with you about that. Or it's like saying, hey, can we have a situation where 7-year-olds only work in a factory a couple hours a day? Because really, no, we want comprehensive child labor legislation. No children in a factory, period. Right? So data ownership is like that kind of negotiation. The data exists. You get to create all these data from our experience just by taking it without asking, without it being transparent, usurping our decision rights, all of this outside of our awareness. So the real boundary has to begin right at the interface with our experience. I'm walking down the street. Surveillance capitalists have already declared that they are allowed to take my face. I'm on the street, they can take my face. I say no, you cannot have my face. I'm not going to negotiate with you about who owns my smile. You are not allowed to have my face. So data ownership is flawed. It's already, the train has left the station. Same with accessibility and portability.
Can I add something to this?
Yes.
The problem with GDPR is it represents the understanding that we had of the problem 3 years ago when it was created. Now we understand that the data you put into the system, which is what it focuses on, is at most 1% of what we're talking about. The fact that they track everything you do online is like 20 times as important. The metadata, which is the data about what you're doing, what kind of device, where you are you moving still, and all the data that they acquire, right? So think about the banking stuff and the health stuff and the location stuff. Think about the stuff Google gets by scanning, right? Your emails and your documents. Microsoft probably does the same thing. I mean, none of that data is protected by GDPR today. And to your second question about AI, if we aren't clever enough to create great AI without doing about human behavior, then we're really not very talented. I mean, you can do medical stuff without doing human behavior. You can do all kinds of things. I'm just saying, my basic point here is we have to decide where the line is drawn, okay? And my point is you don't need to agree with us on this issue, but I think we need to have the debate. We need to recognize that right now, the train is moving at a bazillion miles an hour, and only that side of the conversation is in the table.
And on that call to action, we have to end.
So can I
just want to, we do have to end, but I do want to thank Shoshana Zuboff and Roger McNamee. I encourage everybody to stick around afterwards to talk to them. You're going to have a book signing afterwards, I believe, right?
Yes, we're hoping that we're both going to have a book
Good,
signing
you're both,
wherever
you're
the
both,
books are.
Exactly.
Go to your politicians and ask them, why is it legal? I mean, the Postal Service and FedEx can't read your mail. Why is it legal for Google to do it? They claim they're a platform. They claim they're a common carrier. Why is it legal for people in the financial services business to sell your most private data? Or people in health apps? Why is that even legal? Just ask your politicians, what are you doing to stop that stuff? Because Shoshana's point is right. None of that should be happening in the first place. Why is Google Street View legal?
So
why is
It's not legal. It's just that it's not illegal.
Ask the questions. Ask the questions. Thank you very much.